It's a great pleasure to introduce Richard Knox. We invited him to speak. I've known him by reputation for a long time and recently got the opportunity to meet him. Mr. Knox currently works with NPR. He joined them in the year 2000. He's covered a broad range of topics in public health, medicine, and science over the years. His reports appear on NPR's morning and weekend editions, All Things Considered, and various newscast bulletins. Prior to that, I knew him by virtue of his being with the Boston Globe, where he wrote many, many articles about various aspects of healthcare. He had written some articles, and eventually a book was published about medical mistakes. And this is an area that's considered a major landmark in the general movement to reduce the incidence of medical errors, which is a recognized issue in healthcare in the U.S. He's a graduate of the University of Illinois and Columbia University, and has held fellowships at Stanford and Harvard universities. He's spoken at too many to list here, important medical meetings, and we're very pleased that he's added our meeting to his list. So, Mr. Knox, please.
I don't need that. I know about myself. Thank you, Dan. And thanks for inviting me to address this annual symposium for patients and caregivers. It's a privilege to be here this morning. As you know, my assigned topic is how to sort out hype from hope. I'd like to change that a little bit to how to avoid hype and still hold on to hope. That seems to capture both the pitfalls of exaggeration and misleading information, and the necessity of remaining positive in the face of treatment advances that don't come as soon as everybody trying to cope with this cruel disease would like. First, permit me to offer a little historical context about media coverage and hype. When I first started reporting on medicine way back in 1969, these topics were not the everyday staples of news that they are today. Most news was purveyed in print. Remember print? In newspapers. There were only 3 network TV news shows. The internet was totally unimagined, even by Al Gore. The medical news that did get into the media tended to fall into 2 genres, gee whiz and heartwarming. The gee whiz articles were breathless, uncritical, and not very informative reports about the latest wonders. Heartwarming feature stories, we called them human interest or soft features, were typically stories of pluck and altruism in the face of medical adversity. It was hard back then to get editors to think of medicine and health as real news that could compete for page 1 space above the fold. Now, of course, gee whiz and bleeding heart stories are still with us, but gradually in the 1970s and 80s, things started to change. Major newspapers and TV networks started hiring medical specialists and even starting weekly health and science sections. Few survive, although encouragingly, as Dan mentioned, the Globe has just started a new medical reporting enterprise called STAT. A new dichotomy of medical coverage got established in these days. My late colleague Victor Cohen of the Washington Post used to call it New Hope or No Hope. Another version might be called The Latest Scare or Cure. But apart from these extremes, medical journalism came of age. Nuance and balance and critical thinking increasingly appeared in the best reports. That continues today alongside the simplistic and heavy-breathing stories and headlines. The fact is, medical advances are rarely black and white. The fact that it often appears that way is not just the fault of the media. Researchers and doctors are subject to fashions, enthusiasms, and pharmaceutical advertising that overreaches. So it's not surprising that that gets reflected in media coverage. Even the best scientists, clinicians, and journalists can be seduced by advances that look big and real, beautiful hypotheses later done in by ugly truths. And even when researchers make real advances, practice is often slow to change. Even after regulatory approval, it often takes a long time to determine whether something is a breakthrough or a bust, a boon to patients or a danger that outweighs the benefit. Just think of radical mastectomies versus less mutilating but more effective surgery. Hormone replacement that exposed menopausal women to greater risk rather than keeping them in their hearts forever young, as the advertising phrase went. Vitamin supplements that increase the risk of cancer. PSA tests and mammograms that many experts now believe lead to unnecessary biopsies and overtreatment. The list is endless. It's a complicated medical world out there, and today's media landscape often amplifies the confusion, even as it offers patients and families a virtual infinity of information sources. The internet is a wonderful thing. I often wonder how we function without it, but it must be used with care. While news media and internet access are making patients more sophisticated and informed, many others are confused and misled. Useful information is more accessible, but bad information goes viral too, and probably more often. Just think of the internet-abetted vaccine deniers and the demonstrable effect they're having on visitors to places like Disney World, or the overreaction to Ebola when it came to these shores. The pitfalls of hyped information and pseudo-information are especially great for people with chronic, progressive, poorly understood disorders such as Parkinson's. Google Parkinson's and stem cell, and you'll get more than 1.2 million hits. I'll bet most of them are extravagant overpromises. Patients' sense of urgency and their desire to believe these promises is all too understandable. So we see desperate patients spending tens of thousands of dollars seeking offshore stem cell treatments for Parkinson's, as Dr. Tarsi mentioned, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, arthritis, emphysema, diabetes, and what have you, on the strength of poorly documented testimonials rather than evidence from credible clinical trials. One such testimonial I saw the other day on the website of one of the most prominent stem cell purveyors profiles a Parkinson's patient who allegedly, quote, experienced improvement in his walking and tremors, unquote, after his first treatment. The stem cell company implies the treatment gave him his life back, but it says nothing about exactly what degree of improvement he allegedly got, how durable it was, what his pre-treatment status was, or how advanced his Parkinson's was. However, the company does warn prospective patients that, quote, you should not expect to experience these results. I suspect this audience knows what kind of information, that kind of information is not good enough. But apparently others, enough others, are persuaded to make the trip, take the chance, and pay the money. For you, perhaps, the challenge of evaluating new information about Parkinson's is more subtle and complicated. So let me offer a top 10 list of tips for sorting out the wheat from the chaff. These are basically the same criteria that I and other veteran medical journalists use. Tip number one, beware of extravagant claims like breakthrough. It's a word that I and others I respect almost never use, for the simple reason that true breakthroughs are so rare. In my book, they include such things as the development of L-DOPA back in the 1960s, and the multi-drug therapy that transformed HIV/AIDS from a fatal infection to a chronic disease. The problem is, we almost never know whether something is going to be a breakthrough right away. Things that seem like big breakthroughs, such as anti-angiogenesis that was supposed to cure cancer in 2 years, as one Nobel Prize winner predicted on the front page of the New York Times back in 1998, often fail to fulfill their promise, even if they do turn out to be incremental advances. Hopefully, diligent and creative scientists will figure out a way to make stem cell therapy a real breakthrough for Parkinson's. But the fact is we just don't know yet. Meanwhile, applying the term breakthrough does more harm than good, and at worst, it's a cruel hoax. Still, you'll often encounter breakthrough claims even from respectable sources. I was struck recently by the title of a new book by Dr. Michael Oken, who, as many of you know, is National Medical Director of the Parkinson's Foundation. It's called 10 Breakthrough Therapies for Parkinson's Disease. I've read the book. It's a comprehensive and careful run-through of new and experimental drugs, deep brain stimulation, stem cells, theories about misfolded proteins and how they propagate through the brain, and many other topics. When I asked Dr. Oken about his use of the word breakthrough, He said he was trying to convey to patients and families the sense of excitement about potential breakthroughs that currently pervades Parkinson's research, and to counter the sense of hopelessness that many feel. But as we talked, he came around to the view that maybe he should have avoided the word breakthrough to characterize current and imminent Parkinson's treatments. In a follow-up email, Dr. Oken said, "I have been thinking, and I wish I had not used the word breakthrough in the title." By the way, he gave me permission to share this with you. My next group of tips, numbers 2 through 9, deal with how you should evaluate what you hear, read, or view about emerging research. Tip number 2, what exactly is the evidence? Does it come from a study, from testimonials and anecdotes, a news release, a doctor's opinion? In deciding whether to report on a claimed advance or a warning, I first consider the source. At NPR and other news outlets I've reported for, our bar was generally high, which is not to say we weren't sometimes taken in by sources that seemed impeccable and trustworthy. Tip number 3 applies to claims based on new studies. Again, the first question is, who did it? And then, why should we believe it? This is why you hear or read so many news stories that referenced studies published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, The Lancet, Nature, PLOS, and other well-thought-of, peer-reviewed journals. Peer review means that the study has been combed over by experts in the field who were not involved in that particular research, and we hope do not have a financial stake in either its outcome or those of rival groups. Peer review is certainly no guarantee of trustworthiness or quality. Even the esteemed New England Journal of Medicine has been embarrassed by studies that were biased by the self-interest of their authors or sponsors. But peer review is as good a proxy for quality as we have. Other source considerations, who the authors are, what are their affiliations, what they've published on the topic in the past. As for the study itself, what kind is it? Human or animal? Often promising studies are lab experiments using animals with an induced form of Parkinson's or another disease. This is not at all the same thing as treating humans with the disease. Such studies are designed merely to point researchers to further research. Whatever they show, don't get too excited about them. If it's a human study, how was it done? Randomized, double-blind clinical trials are the gold standard. Participants are carefully selected to be similar in all known ways. They're randomly assigned to experimental treatment, standard treatment, or sometimes a dummy or placebo treatment, and neither participants nor researchers know who's getting what until the trial is over. These kinds of studies are difficult, expensive, and time-consuming, and therefore they're more or less rare among the whole universe of studies. And more often than not, their publication is followed by criticism that their design was somehow flawed and calls for further studies. Bear in mind that many so-called promising studies are not randomized double-blind clinical trials. They're early assessments of an experimental treatment's safety, not whether or not it works. If it seems to, another study called a phase 2 looks for possible efficacy. These early studies are relatively small and short-term. If they suggest effectiveness, a sponsor, either a federal agency, a philanthropic foundation, or a company, may decide to do a so-called phase 3 trial, as I described earlier. It's a long process, so curb your enthusiasm about reports of early results. Digging deeper, here's tip number 4. Consider how many participated in the study. The bigger the better, the smaller, the more skeptical you should be. Second, who participated? This is crucial and often overlooked in news reports. Age, gender, ethnicity, stage of disease, comorbidities or other diseases suffered by the participants, current and prior treatments by the participants and other characteristics can bias comparisons between treated and untreated patients and invalidate the ability to generalize from the study results to everyone with the disease. This is especially true in diseases such as Parkinson's, which is probably not a single unitary disease. Tip number 5 is pay close attention to what the study measured. What benefits did treated patients gain? What harms did they suffer? And crucially, how are the results stated? Often we will hear that a treatment improves symptoms by X% or increased survival by Y%. This may sound impressive until you look at the absolute differences. Exactly how many participants in the treated group benefited versus the number who did in the untreated group. That can paint a very different picture. And you should also note whether the results were statistically significant, meaning that they were unlikely to have occurred by chance, and how big an overlap there are in the results between the experimental and control groups. Tip number 6, note carefully how long study participants were followed. Again, this is especially important in chronic disorders such as Parkinson's. When people progress at different rates, there can be both early and late effects of treatment, and a placebo effect can give a short-term impression of benefit that cannot be maintained. Tip number 7 is to look for a plausible explanation of how a treatment works, or why the researchers think it does. Scientists call this biological plausibility. It can often come from prior experiments with animals with the same condition, naturally or induced by genetic, pharmacologic, or surgical manipulation, that were given the same treatment. Or it can flow from prior biochemical, physiologic, or genetic knowledge. Biological plausibility is not an absolute requirement for a result to be considered valid. For instance, even though researchers devised deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's 28 years ago, and the FDA approved it 10 years ago, researchers still don't know quite how it works, although they have developed some hypotheses. Tip number 8 is look for what may explain what's causing the observed effect other than the treatments that were given. This is the other side of the biological plausibility coin. A good study will review and discuss these other possible explanations. You should also be alert to what skeptics and critics of the study are saying. Many top journals will commission editorials by leading experts who were not involved in the study in question to put the findings in context and consider contrary explanations of the outcome. Seek out these commentaries and read them. Tip number 9 is consider who paid for the study. Ideally, a study sponsor will be an entity such as one of the National Institutes of Health that has nothing to gain financially from the outcome, which is not to say that the NIH or its grantees don't have biases and hoped-for outcomes. But many studies these days are sponsored by entities that ardently want to produce a positive result. Of course, companies that hope to make the next blockbuster drug and send their stock prices into the stratosphere are the least disinterested, and results of their studies deserve the highest degree of skepticism. You don't have to discount them entirely, but you should look for full disclosure and safeguards, such as complete independence from the sponsor in how the study was designed and the results interpreted. Some academic institutions, such as Harvard, don't allow faculty members to run clinical trials if they have a financial stake in the sponsoring company, partly to safeguard the participants in the trial from ethical abuses. But there is currently fierce debate at Harvard and other places about whether such a rule unduly constrains research. If the rule is done away with, it will require even greater scrutiny of the way clinical trials are conducted and interpreted. And finally, tip number 10. It circles back to my number 1 warning, but I think it bears repeating for people like you who are personally affected by the disease you're reading or hearing about, because it's so important to a healthy and realistic frame of mind. Understand that medical progress rarely happens in great leaps forward, the breakthrough effect I discussed earlier. Game changers do occasionally occur, thankfully, but when progress occurs, it commonly takes a long time to verify a new therapy, get it approved, become embraced by frontline practitioners, secure reimbursement from insurers, and benefit patients. This can be hard, I realize, to accept for Parkinson's patients who understandably feel they don't have long to wait for things that can make a difference in their lives and their very survival. But take heart, everything doesn't depend on research and carefully vetted studies. You probably know, but many of those 60,000 Americans who will get a Parkinson's diagnosis this year probably don't, that there are things you can do that will make a difference while we're waiting for the next big treatment advance. One of them, surely, is exercise. Earlier this year, I did a report for NPR on the impact of exercise on Parkinson's. It focused particularly on a program you've probably heard about, and maybe some of you have even participated in, called Rock Steady Boxing. But I wanted to generalize beyond that, so I did a lot of reading and interviewed leading researchers about exercise and Parkinson's. I discovered there aren't a lot of human studies documenting the effect of exercise, and even less on how it works its effect. However, the clinical experience and the testimonials are very persuasive. Does this sound contradictory? After all, I told you a few minutes ago that you should be wary of anecdotal evidence, right? But keep in mind, properly supervised exercise is not risky, it's not expensive, so it doesn't need to meet the same standard of evidence as, say, a surgical procedure, a stem cell infusion, gene therapy, or a new drug. Yes, we do need more good research on the benefits of exercise, but there's no need to wait for peer-reviewed studies before giving it a try. Dr. Tarsi, whom I interviewed for this report, says he urges patients to engage in some form of purposeful exercise, but he doesn't tell them it will reverse or delay the course of their disorder. Here's the last section of my NPR report. I'd like to play it for you. You'll first hear Dr. Tarsi talking about the change he sees in a lot of patients who engage in various kinds of exercise programs. I hope. Hit it.
They looked a lot different walking out an hour later than they did walking in. They literally had a bounce to their step. It sounds a little hokey, but it actually seems to be the case.
Tarsi says patients often report their movements become more fluid. That's the opposite of the rigid, jerky movements typical of Parkinson's. In fact, a 2012 study from the University of Oregon found Parkinson's patients who did 6 months of Tai Chi and weightlifting had better balance and were less likely to fall. And other recent studies show that Parkinson's symptoms improve with cycling and treadmill workouts.
People are surprised by how well they can do, realize they're not really paralyzed, they're just constricted or constrained. They're wearing the straitjacket that's called Parkinson's disease.
Exercise can liberate them from that straitjacket, Tarsi says.
They say, I can do this. And in many of those people, it carries over into everyday life.
Scientists are trying to figure out just how exercise can counter the effects of Parkinson's and possibly even prevent it. One clue is that animals with an experimental form of the disease have higher levels of dopamine, the brain chemical that's deficient in Parkinson's, if they're made to exercise. Peter Wayne at Harvard Medical School is looking at how the brains of Parkinson's patients change in response to 6 months of exercise. He's using a type of exercise very different from boxing, the ancient Chinese art of Tai Chi.
Because the movements of Tai Chi are geared to be upright, to be moving, they translate a little better into going downstairs and walking in aisles at the supermarket and being able to lift and put things down carefully.
Wayne thinks patients use undamaged parts of their brains to compensate for the areas that normally control automatic movements, such as walking. That's because Tai Chi engages both mind and body. And it may be that any kind of purposeful exercise is a tonic for the brain, particularly those that involve music, like drumming or dancing.
15 seconds to get a break.
Back at the gym, that's how Mike Quaglia sees it.
It's all about pushing yourself past your limits and reaching that point where you don't think you can reach. And you get that runner's high, your neurons start clicking, and you get new cells working. Everything works more effectively.
And then there's the social aspect of it. Rich Gingras, the owner of the Rhode Island gym, says Parkinson's patients often sit at home and get depressed.
And they're not moving at all. It's a movement disorder. So them coming in here and just moving around and being happy, everybody's smiling, it's great.
And after all, there's nothing more therapeutic than a smile. For NPR News, I'm Richard Knox.
So at this point, I'm happy to take questions if you have them. Any thoughts about hype or hope? Yes, over here. That's the question is, how do you know what kind of Tai Chi practitioner to trust? I don't know. You know that actually. I think there are websites that you can explore. There are patient support groups. There are people like Lissa Kappas, whom you're going to hear from later, who would be good resources, who probably know who's out there and have some real experience with them. You know, I know Dr. Wayne at Harvard Medical School has some information online. I think there are resources like that. And I think nothing is better than talking to other patients who've actually been to practitioners and can tell you whether they thought it was they were good or not. There was back there.
You mentioned an article with the provocative title of 10 Breakthroughs. And I can imagine that an article titled 10 Potential Improvements would not have sold as well or been as enticing to people. What can folks like you in the media do to teach us as consumers to use more responsible language so that we can begin to sort the wheat from the chaff a little more easily?
Yes, I hope everybody heard that. How do you use the right language and still sell books or get people to read your newspaper articles or listen to your radio report, or for that matter, how as a journalist do you persuade an editor who's the gatekeeper that what you have to say is important enough to use the valuable real estate of, say, all things considered. That's really, you've identified the main tension. By the way, that was a book by Dr. Michael Oken, who's a very credible source, and not just an article. And the reason I use it as an example is because he is such a credible source. He said that maybe I should have had my book read by some journalists, not just some patients and doctors, because the journalists might have been more likely to pick up on that breakthrough word. Well, I think use of language and precision in language and still getting across, this is important, you should pay attention to this, is the main challenge of a medical reporter. And it's a continuous one. I have been guilty of hype more often than I'd like to think about. I've written a lot of things over the years and reported on things that didn't pan out, that seemed really good at the time. And I probably used excessive enthusiasm or displayed excessive enthusiasm in writing about it because I thought they were good and people should know about them. So it's not perfect, but I hope over the course of my 45 years in writing about this stuff that I've tried to be precise. One of the things that irritates those of us who are toiling in these vineyards is that we all get tarred by the same brush, and people remember the hype and assume that we're all like that. It's a real challenge. I think one of the reasons I enjoyed working for the Globe and NPR is that we tried to be very careful, and I think that you can get pressured to overstate things, even in the best places, like the New England Journal of Medicine and the Boston Globe and NPR, and you just have to resist it and hope that you get across a more subtle message, a more nuanced message, perhaps. Anybody else?
Let me
Need to go on?
thank you very much. You will have